Welcome to the Smart Business Revolution.
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 You want a revolution?
You say you want a revolution?
Revolution. The revolution.
It's going on right now.
Welcome to The Revolution, the Smart Business Revolution podcast, where we ask today's most successful entrepreneurs to share the tools and strategies they use to build relationships and connections to grow their revenue. Now, your host for The Revolution, John Corcoran.
All right, welcome everyone. John Corcoran here. I'm the host of the Smart Business Revolution podcast, where I talk with really smart CEOs, founders, and entrepreneurs of companies and organizations like YPO, EO, Activation Blizzard, LendingTree, OpenTable, Axe Software, and many more. I'm also the co-founder of Rise 25 Media, where we help to connect B2B business owners to their ideal prospects, referral partners, strategic partners. I'm really excited today because my guest is Carl Arnold. Now, Carl is an entrepreneur who sold two companies, scaled a company up to over $100 million, which is unbelievable. He's actually also a Vistage Chair, a business coach, offers entrepreneurial leadership consulting to CEOs, executives, and business owners all around the San Francisco Bay Area, which is where I'm located. He's also a born and bred businessman, starting his first venture at the age of 12. So we'll ask him a little bit about that, how he got started, and was born into the industry that he went into, which is hospitality and restaurant industry. So we'll get into all that. But first, before we do, this episode is brought to you by Rise 25 Media. Now, if you've been listening for a while, you know how passionate we are about podcasting and content marketing that really up-levels your network. And we are evangelists for this medium because with a podcast, I've noticed it over the last 10 years of doing this, everyone should start a podcast, because even if no one's listening, you will derive tremendous benefits from your life just from up-leveling your network and connecting with smart people. It's really like a Swiss Army knife. It's a tool that accomplishes so many things at once, can and will lead to great clients, but it will also lead to great friendships and great connections and great referral partners and great strategic partners. It's so many things at once. And I personally, feel like I can't personally help every person to start or run their podcast, but we will try and inspire every person that we can to do it one way or the other, because you will love it and it's a tremendous benefit that will flow to your life. So to learn more, go to rise25media.com and you can learn all about it. All right, as I mentioned, our guest is Carl Arnold. Carl, as I said, he is a Vistage chair right now. He's got a couple of groups in the San Francisco Bay Area leading executives and CEOs. He was kind enough to have me come in and speak at one of them, which was a lot of fun. And, before we get into this interview, I also want to thank Anastasia Toomey, who's a certified EOS implementer, Colby certified instructor based out of Denver, frontporchresults.com. Go check out her website. She introduced me to Carl, which is really kind of her. But Carl, let me start right here, because you went and you studied hospitality, hotel management, and restaurant management, and also, interestingly, music. And your life could have turned out quite differently, because you immediately went out and you toured with a band for a year before your life kind of went in a different direction. You were accepted to the leadership program at the historic St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco. Beautiful property, which I've stayed at before. Really the pride of San Francisco in many ways. But what musical instrument did you play? And what was that like?
Well, John, first of all, I want to thank you for having me on the podcast today. And it's really a joy. I know that I've had a chance to meet you in the past, and Anastasia has said so many wonderful things that it's just a treat to be on here and have a chance to speak with you. Interestingly, yeah, I'm a drummer, and I still play drums a lot, and I play all kinds of drums, hand drums, drum set, Latin drums, timbales, congas, and it's been a huge part of my life since, I guess I started at age 10. Wow. So I've been doing it for a really long time, and had an opportunity to play with a lot of great bands and musicians over the years. But I really started out in college studying business administration with a minor in music, and I majored in hotel and restaurant management. And so as time goes on, you find that they all sort of run together, because there used to at least always be music in the hotels, and I'd
Mm.
work in the industry, and I'd be working in the hotel business at the St. Francis, and then I'd go see if I could get a gig playing the drums with a band,
Wow.
sometimes even in the same hotel.
So you got
Uh,
to a point where you were managing thousands of workers. Did you just like go in and sit in with the band? And what was that like for everyone to like see, or
well,
did you go do a gig off to the side somewhere else and maybe
I
someone
was
who worked for you
yeah.
would pop in and find you
No,
there?
yeah, I'd usually be someplace else. I worked at the St. Francis Hotel and did have a chance to play. And when I was there, I went through their management training program, and this is right out of college. And actually, right out of college, I went on the road with the band and did that for a year. And I realized at that point, at some point, I think it was when we were working 6 nights a week, and I had one night off. And during that one day, we would drive to the next location, going across the United States and Canada. And then we would set up and play and do it 6 more nights, and then set up and play. And at some point, I realized, this is turning from something I love into a lot of work. And I thought, if I'm going to work, I'd rather work at something where I can make more money, and then I'll keep the drums on the side for fun. And I had a chance to talk to several professional musicians who were up in their 60s, 70 years old, and they said, that's what they wish they had done. They said they love their music, but they wish that they had done something that would really pay the bills a little bit better. There's only really the 0.1% who are the superstars making the big money, and it's a pretty tough road the rest of the way. So I took their advice, and I've really enjoyed being able to work in business and management to make enough money to have a good lifestyle, and then keep the drumming on the side in order to be able to just have something that's not only fun to do with others, but also a great outlet, just even practicing.
Yeah.
And drumming can even be physical, almost like a workout.
Now, I want to ask you, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but percussion could, in a sense, be a metaphor for business or an approach to business in many different ways. Is there parallels that you can draw between those two, why you've been successful in business and also being a drummer?
Well, there probably is. I think one of the things that being a good musician, you need to practice and you need to learn your trade. Once you get comfortable practicing, then you need to start playing with other musicians. And once you get comfortable doing that, then you build up a level of confidence in your own ability that you've learned, as well as your ability to work with others. And that confidence really helps in business. I translate it to leadership. The more confident you are and comfortable and working through a situation, the more confident and comfortable you'll make others. And it helps you. I think one of the big things we do in Vistage, and I don't know if all your listeners know about Vistage, but it's a CEO leadership group that's put together in groups of about 16 people to 18 CEOs who get together once a month as the peer group. So one of the big things we talk about in our groups are leadership. I think that's one of the most important things we can be talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So you grew up in San Francisco or around the Bay Area, which I say to people all the time, it's a world famous city, but it's really a small town, especially people who grew up around here. It's amazing to me, people who grew up in San Francisco, and they just seem to know everyone. So I imagine that was the case with you, but you were born essentially into the hotel and restaurant industries. What did your father and grandfather do?
Yeah, well, my grandfather had a restaurant many, many years ago, and my dad started out after the war, after World War II. He came out to San Francisco and started a boarding house. Actually worked in a boarding house. My mother would cook, and my dad would serve, and they would clean the rooms, and they ended up working their way to manager, and eventually bought their first boarding house like that. These were boarding houses back after the war. There just wasn't enough suitable housing for people, and so you'd have multiple families living in a house that was sort of converted into like a B&B, if you will. And so they ran that, and eventually he bought his first hotel, and he ended up having a small group of hotels in the senior citizen, providing hotels on for senior citizens. And so did kind of grow up with it that way, and then I ended up working in the hotel business or at the St. Francis and the Clift and Sun Valley, Idaho, and the Duchin Room and the restaurant business, and had an opportunity to join a company that provided contract hotels for, you were talking about the railroads and the airlines. These were providing hotel rooms for their engine train crews, as well as their pilots and flight attendants for the airlines.
Right. So this was Milepost Industries, which I want to get to that. But first, before we do, you really started your first venture at a young age. You were 12 years old, selling hot dogs and sodas and Cokes at Cal Stadium football games. What was that? What inspired that? Was it your upbringing? Were you just driven at a young age to go make money?
Yeah, I was driven. I think one of the things my mom and dad did is, and I think of it as really something they did for me that I'm thankful for now. But when all my friends were getting a little allowance each week as a kid, they say, look, we're going to give you an allowance, but it's going to be smaller than the other kids, probably a half or a third of 2/3 of it. But if you want more money, just work. You can get some. So I would first of all, I would do some work around the house, and they'd actually sort of pay me for it. And then eventually I worked I got my first job, I think, when I was 12, selling soda and peanuts at football games. So I started out doing that, and then eventually worked in a gas station and a sporting goods store. And in high school, I had jobs after school, and I didn't know any different. I just thought that's what everybody did in a way, and I always had enough money to do the things I liked, and so I found actually that was kind of a nice thing that my folks did for me.
Mm. What was it like working for Milepost? So you said you joined Milepost, and they served railroad employees. So they had hotels around railroads, I imagine?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I left the St. Francis Hotel to work at Milepost. And at the time, Milepost had, I think, 11 motels. And I had a chance to, I started out working for them, coming from this big hotel of 1,000 rooms, 1,100 rooms, to these small motels that had maybe 70 to 100 rooms. And they were, but it was a good business model because the railroad would pay us for 100% occupancy on a long-term guarantee, a 10-year guarantee. So
there's probably a lot of hotels that wish they had that right now.
Yeah, you're not kidding.
We're recording this in late April 2020 with the coronavirus craziness unfolding all around us. But, including the St. Francis Hotel, and many hotels are closed right now, completely closed.
They're closed. They're running 10, 20, 30% occupancy. So a guarantee of 100% was a really nice thing. Now, of course, we gave them a good discount, but we were able to make that work. So I left the St. Francis and went to work there, and had a lot of success. Worked my way up from doing everything, from cleaning rooms to manager, and then and also we had restaurants associated with them. So I worked as a cook, short order cook, which I'll tell you, that's where you really learn what you're made out of doing a short order cook, especially in the middle of the night when people that are intoxicated come in about 2 a.m. and just order everything, omelets and everything under the sun.
Jeez.
But anyway, had a good did that, and had an opportunity to buy out one of the owners. Worked my way up to eventually running operations for the whole company for these 12 units, and bought out the owner. But the deal was I had to grow the company in order to really keep paying him out, because I paid him out over a 10-year period. And so that was, I tried a number of things growing it. I tried consultants, and I had different, I put together an outside board of advisors. But the thing that really helped me the most was I joined a Vistage group, which is what I'm leading now. But at the time I was a member, and I did that for 7 years. And over that period of time, that's when grew the company dramatically. Not just for those, we had started out with 11 motels really for the railroad, and we ended up adding a shuttle division where we ended up, in the end, we had 1,000 vehicles with 3,500 employees, and we had 25 hotels or motels in the United States, and then about the same in Canada. And then in my conversations with the railroads, I said, well, we can do this. What else do you need? And they said, well, we need somebody to manage our office buildings. So we set up a facilities management division. And in the end, we had 58 office buildings that we were managing for various railroads around the United States.
And by the way, so you took it from 3.5 million in 1980 to over 100 million in 1998, over 18 years. That's amazing.
That is correct. Yeah.
Amazing.
And it was interesting because getting that 3.5 to 5 million seemed to take forever. And then getting 5 million to 10 million took a really long time. And then we kind of bounced to 20, and then 20, it didn't take, it was a relatively quick moving up to about 35 and 50. And then from 50, we just started jumping up to 100. The biggest issue we had was capitalization. How do we capitalize the growth? And that was where actually my Vistage group came in very handy, because we were looking all over the place for capital, and all the people who would give us money wanted a controlling interest in the company, which I really didn't want to give up. And my Vistage group gave me some great ideas where we were able to do it through debt, and I ended up retaining 100% ownership even up until the time I sold the company.
Wow. You had 3,500 employees at one point. What was it like managing that number of people? That's just a really large number.
Well, the key was for me to build a really good executive team and to learn. That's why I go back to the leadership. I think once you build, and I tried to get someone who was overqualified and somebody that I respected as being an expert in their field and knowing more about that than I knew. And so I was not one of these people that wanted to know everything and wanted to run everything. I was willing to delegate, but it was a big learning experience on how to manage people that were experts that knew a lot more than me about these things, and how to manage them without micromanaging them, but how to still be able to do that. So that was a real lesson. And
any mistakes you made along the way with that, with putting the wrong people in place, the wrong executives?
Yeah, I don't know if we have enough time to go into all the mistakes I made, but yeah.
Pick one or two that we can learn from.
Well, I think the biggest one that I would say I probably made was along the way. Well, first I'll say that one of the big mistakes was I did try to do a lot of it myself. As our fleet of vehicles, for instance, started growing to 100, 200 vehicles, and eventually up to 1,000, I needed to. I finally found I needed a fleet manager, and then a safety manager, and so I had to get over this thing of having to try to do it all myself. So that was, and I see that with a lot of the Vistage members and the groups that I'm now leading, is that it's hard to put somebody good in place and then get out of the way and let them do what they need to do. Um, and so I heard it explained. Uh, uh, like some people think that and also you need to still keep checking in on them. And I heard it explained, it's like a marriage. You don't want to just go out and find a great spouse and then never talk to them again. And once a year say, I love you. You need to be constantly staying in contact with them. And that's the same thing with a great team. You don't want to just hire them and then once a year give them a bonus. You need to be keeping that level of communication open to motivate and keep them excited about being with you.
That's great advice. I wanted to ask you mentioned about the vehicles. You had over 1,000 vehicles at one point. With all the disruption that we've seen in recent years, like Super Shuttle, which was a huge company for many years, I think declared bankruptcy 6 months ago or something like that. Ubers and Lyfts and things coming along. What advice would you have, or put yourself in your shoes if you were still managing that company and you still had 1,000 vehicles in your fleet and this kind of disruption is coming along? What's your thought process? What do you do when that kind of change hits your industry that's going to affect your business and your bottom line so dramatically?
I think that's a good question. I would really try to embrace the change rather than fight it. You can be right and end up losing everything. But if you make a few mistakes along the way and try different things and embrace the change, you can go quite a ways. And that's what I really think Uber and Lyft have done. They took an old industry like the taxi business, which has been around for years and years. And I remember in San Francisco, you could never get a taxi when you wanted it, especially if it was raining out. You'd wait and then somebody else would steal your taxi. Now, Uber and Lyft come along with this technology that just totally disrupted it. And now you're upset if you have to wait 10 minutes for an Uber. So It's really been, and I think what they did is they took a different approach. I think Super Shuttle, I think of my business, we had to do everything. Every time we moved the vehicle, people had to sign something in triplicate. And then we had 3 pieces of paper that we had to deal with. And I had 30 or 40, close to 40 actually at the peak, people in our accounting office, just in the home office, processing pieces of paper. And every once in a while, then our client would want to audit us, and then they'd take exception, and then we'd have to go spend hours and hours going back, reviewing things that happened in the past. If you could embrace the technology and have something like the Uber program involving geospatial and billing and mapping, then I think that my business would be. I wish I still had it if I'd had that technology, but we really didn't have it, and I had a good opportunity to sell, so I did. But with that technology, that business would be a lot better. So I just say, you really need to embrace change. And we're going through that with the COVID-19. Everything is changed. We have our meetings, we talk about the Vistage meetings, and we're going to probably talk about that later, but typically they've always been face-to-face, and everybody said, oh, it's all about relationships and that sort of thing. We're having these meetings, we're having cocktail parties, we're having check-ins on Zoom right now, and and it's working out really well. In fact, people seem to get a lot of value, especially in these really uncertain times right now when they have
That's great.
a
That's
group
great.
they can lean on.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and I mean, certainly the role of a group like that is tremendous in these times, even more so than in, you could argue than in the good times, because now it's so urgent, it's so critical. There's so many different moving parts. I want to ask you about, in 1998 or so, you sell Milepost Industries. I don't know what multiple you got for selling that, or what you sold it for, but it's a big payday. It's a big victory. How did you come about the decision to sell? Why did you decide to sell? And even more interesting to me is you didn't just go relax on a beach somewhere. You started a new company. So I want to ask, I'll pause on that and I'll come back to that. But first, why sell and how did that come about?
I started out, but towards the end, we had 1,000 vehicles, and a transportation consultant saw one of our vehicles, and he was representing another company and said he'd like to inquire if we'd be for sale. And as I'd mentioned before, we were growing and needed capital, and I was really not happy bringing in a partner who was going to take controlling interest if I was going to still be there. But I was willing to talk to this person, and he introduced me to his client, and the client said, "We'd just like to buy you out lock, stock, and barrel." And that brought on a whole new, outlook for me that I hadn't really thought about much before. I'd been thinking about raising money, and I hadn't really thought about just selling. And which is interesting because we have now in our groups, we have experts come in and talk to us. And we recently had somebody that talked about how do you prepare yourself for selling, and how do you get your company to maximize its value, and how do you, when do you decide when to sell? And most people do, I guess, kind of what I did, is that it's just by happenstance. Somebody comes along, makes them an offer, and they sell. The people who are, and in my case, it just happened to be at the top of the market, so I was lucky. But it was at 1998, dot-com bubble of 1998, actually. But many people get the offer, and they sell, and it could be at the bottom of the market. Or their company, they may not have done certain things to maximize the value of it prior. Simple things like maybe even having audited financial statements, having a policy, employee handbooks, and things like that. So if you have certain just nuts and bolts things like that in place, it will add value to your company. So luckily, we had a lot of those things that I'd been learning about through Vistage, through these speakers. And so when these guys came along and offered, we took the offer, and even actually somebody in my Vistage group suggested that I have somebody else help us to negotiate. And they offered a person up who came from Ernst & Young. We paid him by the hour, so I didn't have to give him a percentage of the deal. And that actually worked out really well too. So that's kind of how it all came about. Somebody just saw one of the vans and called me up with the phone number on the side of the van.
And so I've heard many business owners say this, that oftentimes after they sell, they fall into a depression. But what was it like for you? Were you excited?
I was really excited and did a lot of traveling and things I wanted to do for the first few months after the sale. But yeah, when the honeymoon sort of period is over, when the dust settles, then you got to decide what do I want to do with the rest of my life. And I was fairly young at that time, and so I started doing some nonprofit work, and then then I decided I basically wanted to kind of re-career and try something different.
And so was that a temporary foray before you started the Arnold Hotel Group?
Well, I started the Arnold Hotel Group right before I actually sold the Milepost Industries.
Hmm.
So that was about 2 years before. While we were running Milepost Industries, the airline said we'd like to have hotels for our flight crews, pilots and flight attendants. And so I set up, we ended up building and operating 3 commercial hotels that we operated strictly for one of the major airlines. And so those two sort of overlapped.
Okay. And what was the career change then?
Well, the career change was I eventually sold the Arnold Hotel Group and decided I loved finance. I wanted to be in the finance world, and so I had an opportunity to work at Morgan Stanley with a
Mm.
high-powered investment group, and went to work with them. And did that, ended up doing that for a number of years until I eventually came over to Vistage.
That's such a funny thing for you to go to, from the level of achievement of selling a company that has gone from $3.5 million to $100 million to then some might argue take a step backwards or sideways to then work in financial services. What was that like? I mean, were people like, wait a second, what are you doing here? What was that like?
Well, it worked out well because Morgan Stanley at the time had a special program for what they called seasoned executives,
Okay.
and they would bring them in at a pretty good salary and teach them the ropes and hope that they could help build their book of business with Morgan Stanley. And I actually read a book about how do you find your next job doing something that you really want to do. And so I drew a line on a paper. On the one side, I put the things I didn't want to do, and on the other side, all the things I did want to do. And some are basic, like I didn't want to travel anymore. When I had Milepost Industries, the Arnold Hotel Group, there were 70 different
Wow.
profit centers with 3 major offices. Most of those were on the East Coast by the
Mm,
end. And so I was in a plane all the time. So one of the
mm.
things I didn't want to do is I didn't want to travel. And another thing is I wanted to work as something that would really mentally stimulate me. And I've always been really interested in investments. And so this gave me a great opportunity to learn. In fact, I went back and got my Series 7 and all my
Wow.
various licenses that you need to be in financial services. So
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
was kind of like going back to college days again, and by this time I was, I guess, in my 50s. So
Seems to be a theme with you. Well, we're running short on time. So in a couple of minutes, talk a little bit about why Vistage, why you decided to get involved in Vistage after having been a member for many years.
yeah, well, I was a member for many years, and I had been in contact with the chair. Now, the chair is really the leader of the person that puts the groups together and then helps facilitate the groups. And so I'd been in contact with my Vistage chair for all throughout the years. In fact, I'd built a great bond with my group that I stayed in contact with a lot of them still to this day, from back in the 90s. But anyway, he suggested that I come be a Vistage chair myself, and that I'd really get a lot of benefit and enjoyment out of it. And so I went ahead and on a leap of faith, decided this would be a great thing to do. And I was ready I figured I had maybe one more change in me. So I did that about 7 years ago, and really have enjoyed it because I love connecting with people, which is kind of part of the reason I think I like financial services. But I like connecting with people, I like helping people, and I like learning. And I'm constantly learning at this job and constantly having an opportunity to help people, especially with the COVID-19, right now we're really hunkering down and having a lot of different, more casual meetings so that people can help each other.
Yeah. Well, you're really in your element, having seen you do it, facilitating the group, having come in and spoke. It really feels like everything you've done up until this point has really led you to that. And so I think it's kudos to you that you found something that you really enjoy doing. But let me wrap everything up because I know we have to go. But the question I always enjoy asking, let's pretend we're at an awards banquet, much like the Oscars or the Emmys. And Carl, you're receiving an award for lifetime achievement for everything you've done up until this point. Who do you thank? Who are the mentors? Who are the friends? In addition to family, of course, in addition to friends, of course, who are the people you acknowledge?
Well, of course, I would have to thank my father. I think I did learn a lot from him. He had a great business sense. He was also a great raconteur and musician himself, and he also had a great sense of humor. And I think those are all really important things that I try to incorporate into my practice. I also brought on a person who was very influential to me when I was building my team, and he had actually already built a large company and retired and was bored with retirement. And so I brought him out of retirement, and he and I are still great friends to this day. And he was a huge help. I do love to read biographies, and I would say, Richard Branson as somebody that I would really look up to, and as well as a number of other great business leaders for all, Jim Collins, and
Good to
Jim
great,
Collins,
great by choice. Yeah.
he's doing a lot of work with Vistage right now too.
Oh, interesting.
And I just heard him speak at one of our get-togethers, and actually had a chance to meet him. So, those are probably some of the maybe 3 top people for me.
That's great.
4.
All right, Carl, where can people learn more about you?
Great. Well, yes, I have a website called arnoldleaders.com, ARNOLD, and then leaders.com. And that's probably the best way. You can also look at me up on LinkedIn. It's Carl Arnold, AIF, are the initials after my LinkedIn profile. So love to chat with people, especially if they're in the Bay Area, and CEOs or business leaders that would be interested in learning more about peer groups and how they can help them to grow their businesses. One last thing I'll say is that interestingly, Vistage groups have grown at twice the rate. Their Vistage-led companies have grown at twice the rate of non-Vistage-led companies. And in the last downturn, it was 15 times the rate, if you can imagine that.
Wow.
So this is a time where, even if you're not in my group or in Vistage, this is where you really need to get with peers and talk and brainstorm, because this is where it's time to really pivot and think about how you can maybe do something a little differently to take advantage of the situation, this unfortunate situation that we're in right now in the economy.
Yes, that's great advice. Carl, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Smart Business Revolution podcast with John Corcoran. Find out more at smartbusinessrevolution.com. And while you're there, sign up for our email list and join the revolution.
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 And be listening for the next episode of the Smart Business Revolution podcast.